Shalom, shalom. Welcome as always to your channel, our Able Code channel, where we have the pleasure, the joy, and also the responsibility to try to give you all the knowledge possible, considering, of course, our limitations, to teach you how to interpret. With the difficulties that this entails, the most important book in the history of civilization, the Bible. With this course, which is also free, we hope that you, whether you have never read the Bible or you fall asleep every time you read it, with the sole tool of having the will to learn through curiosity, can begin not only to read, but to study all the sacred biblical and post-biblical texts for your intellectual and spiritual growth. Behind me is a photograph of a mikveh, or a Hebrew liturgical bath from the time of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. In addition to acquiring academic knowledge in history and archaeology through this class, you will also understand the forces at work in the spiritual world, how to perceive them, and how to protect yourself from them. This is what it's all about, shining light into the darkness. As the psalmist says, your word, the Hebrew word written here as Torah, is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path, written in Psalm 119, verse 105. On this channel, we don't care about your religion, faith, culture, race, status, or age. This is a course for all who want to approach the original source of the Torah, whether through Kabbalah, metaphysics, or the study of Judaism and early Christianity as pillars of Judeo-Christian civilization. The Mishna is the key that will open the gates of knowledge encoded in the Torah. Without further ado, this is Abel Flores. Thank you for being here. We begin a class that will change your perspective on the spiritual world around you, even if you can't see it with your physical eyes. That's what it's all about, seeing beyond what can apparently be seen. The great men of humanity, who left a transcendent and transcendental legacy, did so, and you can too. You just need the will, because there is no worse blind person than the one who refuses to see. Let's begin. Now let's delve into our study today from this free course on the Código Abel channel about the Mishnah, the key to biblical exegesis. Today we're talking about Mishnah Berakhot 3.6, which reads as follows. A Zav who saw a seminal emission, and a menstruating woman who expelled semen, and a woman who had relations with her husband and saw menstrual blood require immersion. But Rabbi Yehudah exempts them. So, continuing with the previous discussion of Mishnah Berakhot 3.5, which you can see in the YouTube video list of this channel if you haven't seen it or want to repeat it, we will study the halakot, or rabbinic regulations for immersion in a mikveh in order to conduct Torah study, and the Amidah prayer for someone who has experienced a seminal emission. Remember that these laws only applied in ancient times, such as when the Temple of Jerusalem stood and during the Mishnah during the 1st and 2nd century CE. However, today, and since the 16th century, when the Shulchan Aruch was standardized, none of these laws apply with the severity they did in those days. That is, this is why we can speak of Judaisms, because in each era there have been different interpretations and contexts, but always with the Torah of Moses as our constitution. The reason is that many of these laws depended on the temple, and today, without a temple, they have the authority of the rabbis, that is, of the customs and protective barriers for fulfilling the Torah. But today, they are customs, traditions, and in some cases, the chumrad of ultra-Orthodox communities, but they are not normative for the entire people. So, this Mishnah or teaching discusses a case where individuals who are already impure, with a severe form of ritual impurity, not only due to seminal emission like the ball keri we studied in the previous Mishnah, but now the case is more difficult. But they are also exposed to the impurity of a seminal emission. That is, the people mentioned here have one grave impurity and a lesser one, 2 or more impurities, because impurity, like the soul, like purity, like almost everything in this creation, has levels. So, what we really have to talk about is in the plural, of impurities, of souls, of purities, of worlds, of the heavens, of Judaisms, of Christianities, of sciences, of colors, of music, of cultures, of men and women. The only unique thing is God, because He and only He is the exception to His creation, because one cannot confuse creation with the Creator, as pagan cultures did. Plurality and levels are concepts that are very present in the Bible, and those who don't understand them tend to misinterpret the scriptures, even to say something contrary to the biblical text itself. Because those who don't know the context don't understand the context, a simple axiom of exegesis, philology, and communication sciences. So, this Mishnah deals with cases that are different from the previous ones, from those in the previous classes. They are more complicated and exceptional cases because the Tanna Kamma, who is Yehudah Hanasi, the writer and editor of the Mishnah, wants to teach you the power of knowing how to interpret the Torah because the Torah touches on every single thing in this life. Only it does so in a coded way. The Mishnah decodes this secret message, like when you are given a wrapped gift and you have to open it. Thus, these individuals in this Mishnah are required to immerse themselves and purify themselves from the impurity of seminal emission, like a ball keri, even though they remain impure due to the more severe impurity. That is, here we are speaking of two impurities of one who is impure twice. Consequently, even a zav, which we will explain later what this is, whose impurity lasts at least 7 days, and who experienced a seminal emission like a ball keri, for which, if he were not a zav, he would be impure for only 1 day. But it also speaks of a menstruating woman who discharged semen from sexual intercourse, despite the fact that she is already impure with severe impurity unaffected by her immersion. And it also speaks of a second case in which a woman who had conjugal relations with her husband and then saw menstrual blood, then all of them require immersion. And Rabbi Yehudah exempts them from immersion. But here comes a question. If the one who wrote the entire Mishnah, from beginning to end, was Yehudah Hanasi, why is he quoting himself? From what we've studied in past classes in this course, because all the Mishnayot that lack authorship, that don't have an explicit author, are, according to rabbinic tradition, Mishnayot of Rabbi Meir. So what's happening here is that for the first time, Rabbi Yehudah Hanasi, aka the Prince, is differing in opinion from one of his teachers, Rabbi Meir, who is said to have memorized up to 3,000 teachings with a precision that today we would call gifted. So, the literal text of this Mishnah reads as follows: a zav who saw a seminal emission, and a niddah woman who expelled semen, and a woman who had relations with her husband, and saw menstrual blood require immersion, but Rabbi Yehudah exempts them. The previous Mishnah of Berakhot 3:6 addressed the rules of immersion for Torah study and tevilah after a seminal emission, Takana decreed by the scribe Ezra on a ball keri man, that is, a man who had a seminal emission either through sexual intercourse or by accident, such as a wet dream. But now our Mishnah extends the case to people who are already more severely impure, such as a zav man or a niddah woman, and also contracted Tanna Kamma. The discussion is not about the purity of the temple. In other words, we are not talking about the purity of the Kohanim or priests to be able to work in the temple. Rather, we are talking about the suitability to recite and study according to Ezra's decree, which was later annulled due to lack of public acceptance and its danger of diminishing and nullifying the Torah, as we explained in previous classes. Here we need to understand these technical terms, anchored in Leviticus 15. A zav is a man with a prolonged abnormal discharge. His impurity lasts 7 days and generates midras, impurity, due to pressure. This is an extraordinary case. Even from a modern perspective, we are talking about a man who has a health or medical problem with his sexual system. A niddah is a woman with menstrual discharge. It also implies 7 days of impurity in the Torah. In other words, we are talking about a woman who has her menstrual cycle. We also need to know what a shishvat zerah is, which in Hebrew means an emission of semen. Its emission makes one unclean until nightfall and requires washing, that is, entering the mikveh. When a woman spills semen, in Hebrew, pelatat zerah, she also becomes unclean, in classical halacha, up to 3 days after intercourse. Another important term is meshemshet, a woman who has had intercourse. If she immediately sees blood, and it turns out to be niddah, she enters into severe impurity for 7 days, as if she were a niddah. And the Mishnah we studied says that all of them require immersion. So here it refers to the prior tevilah in order to study Torah or perform the middah prayer for Tanna Kamma, which deals with the impurity of the ball keri by decree of Ezra. even if they remain impure due to major impurity. That is, here we are talking about two impurities, the minor, which are impurities according to the interpretation of the judges or rabbis, such as Ezra, the famous biblical scribe. These are impurities that last one day, until nightfall after entering the mikveh. But the severe impurities, those that last 7 days, such as that of the Zav, who is a man who sheds semen due to some illness, or the niddah woman, who is someone who menstruates, since these are impurities according to the Torah of Moses, then this is not being discussed, because these are impurities against the sanctity of the temple. That is, a Zav has a 7-day period of impurity, and this is from the Oreda or Torah. He is impure according to Moses. However, if he enters the mikveh, he can study Torah and pray the Amidah, because this is a decree of Ezra. It is something from the judges, from the laws of men. It is derabanan. Also remember, because I will not stop warning you, in today's Judaism these laws do not apply. Since the 16th century with the Shulchan Aruch, none of these laws apply as a norm for the entire people. They're optional, like Tumrat, which some ultra-Orthodox follow today, but they cannot be imposed on the entire community, as Rabbi Gamliel taught. And the severe impurities of the Torah, such as that of the Zav man or the niddah woman, do not apply today because there is no temple, and without it, these commandments are inoperative. So the structure and logic of this Mishnah presents 3 borderline or exceptional cases: a Zav who also had a keri, a niddah who expels semen, the remnant of coitus, and a woman who cohabited and saw blood, resulting in a niddah. The Tanna Kamma requires tevilah for the addition of tumat keri, or seminal impurity, even though the primary impurity, that of the Torah, remains. But Rabbi Yehudah exempts. He suggests that Ezra's takana does not apply when the tevilah does not serve for the greater state of impurity. But what's really going on here is, how is it possible for the editor of the Mishnah to contradict his own Mishnah, learned from his teacher, who, because it is an authorless Mishnah, we know is Rabbi Meir? Well, the fact is that Rabbi Meir's Mishnah dates back to the time the temple was standing, and the gezerah decree of Ezra the scribe was in effect. However, when Rabbi Yehudah wrote this, there was no longer a temple, the impurities of the Torah were inoperative, and Ezra's decree had been annulled by the Sanhedrin because it harmed the Torah instead of glorifying and expanding it. Why? For the usual reason, because times change. The Talmud in Berakhot 22a and b specifies that Ezra decreed immersion only for a healthy bial keri, normal emission, and later the decree was annulled, bitlu tevilat Ezra, because it was not sustainable communally, as we have already explained. Furthermore, this passage mentions the controversy with the tevilah shesharet, those who bathed every morning before reciting the Amidah to be pure, illustrating the social tension surrounding the practice. The sages defended the possibility of reciting the name without this extra immersion, to make it easier for the people to recite the Amidah, which in those days of the Mishnah was recited alongside the Shema. The current halacha follows Rabbi Yehudah in the result, exemption from tevilah for Torah and tevilah for keri, not because the Mishnah establishes it per se, but because the normative foundation, Takanat Ezra, no longer applies, and because there is no temple, the impurities of the Torah are inoperative in the cases set forth in this Mishnah, not in all those not set forth here. That is, impure animals remain impure for kosher consumption. Rabbi Yehudah says they are exempt only in the 3 cases set forth here. Now, to try to understand the full context of what is being discussed here, we have no better option than to study what purity, tahara, and impurity, tuma, mean in Judaism, and what these forces teach us about seeing the invisible in your life, in our lives, in creation. The categories of tuma and tahara are established, above all, in the Torah in Leviticus 11-15, regarding food, childbirth, skin conditions, seminal or menstrual flow, and in Numbers chapter 19. We are told about purification by the ashes of the paraduma, the red heifer. These passages define ritual states, not moral or hygienic, that enable or restrict access to the sacred, sanctuary offerings. You have to understand that impurity is not a sin. No one is a sinner for being impure. But why does the Torah teach you, command you to be pure instead of impure? What is so bad about impurity? Well, as we taught in previous classes of this Mishna course, the problem with impurity is that it is food for negative spiritual forces, which are like parasites and they need to eat. But what do they eat if these forces are not material or physical? Well, they eat spiritual impurities or tumit. Remember this concept. They are spiritual parasites, which, like all parasites, seek their benefit and survival at the expense of human beings. These forces steal their spiritual energy, making them weaker. And that is precisely where the whole human being is, in their spiritual weakness, committing sins, more mistakes, as a consequence of bad decisions, worse choices, and you begin to block yourself. You don't remember what you studied. You have bad dreams, bad thoughts. They are energies that help you sin, but they are not sin itself. The key here is to understand that pure or impure describes conditions in some cultural cases. However, they are not equivalent to good and evil, and they are not equivalent to sin. The essential taxonomy, operational summary, of the forces of impurity, which are the food of the forces of evil or darkness, the terminology in more than 2,000 years is broad with multiple names and terms, teaches us that the main sources of tuma, avad hatuma, are mainly the human corpse, the most severe, certain animal corpses and shiratzim, reproductive secretions, semen, menstrual flow, states of tevilah zava, which is that woman who due to illness does not stop bleeding as if she were always in her menstrual flow, childbirth, conditions of the gezerah type or biblical leprosy that most interpreters believe was an ancient disease that was related to speaking lashon hara, malicious tongue due to slander, lying. The Mishnah compiles and organizes these matters in its Seder Taharat, which includes tractates Kalim, Ohalit, Nigam, Para, among others, which we will of course study when the time comes. As we have always taught in this course, there are degrees, levels, and transference. Impurity tuma can be transferred by contact, load/weight, even by being under a shadow, for example, in Ohalit for tumet met. There is a hierarchy, the father, who is the main source, but also lesser degrees, which in the Mishnah are called the first and second degrees. All of this affects, above all, consecrated food and teruma during the temple period, but also sexual relations. These concepts also involve susceptibility. Not every object or person receives tuma. It depends on the material, the use, and the state, alive or dead. We are talking about an animal about to be sacrificed. And if it is properly prepared and free of disease for proper human nourishment, it is kosher. The purification processes involve a mikveh immersion, plus waiting until sunset for most single-day impurities, such as those studied in this class. But there is also a purification process by fire, for anything that can withstand fire, such as metal objects, pots, glasses, and other kitchen utensils, for example. The law is that everything that can withstand or is not destroyed by fire must be purified by fire. In the case of the Kohanim, everything is more complicated because the laws for the Kohanim and Levite priests are different, because according to the Torah, they are different. They have different laws. Therefore, their purification is not only through the water of a mikveh, but they also require the ashes of the red heifer, para aduma, mixed with living waters. This is a Hebraic interpretation of a mikveh, but with ashes from the red heifer to purify tumat met, contact with a human corpse. It is the only biblical way for this case, and you should know that today all the Kohanim who exist, who are alive among us, are ritually impure for their service in the temple, so for the construction and especially the commissioning of the third temple, a red heifer or para aduma must necessarily appear miraculously. Today, without a temple, most of the laws of Tahara are not fully practicable. There are no offerings or consumption of kodashim or consecrated foods, so the issue of tithes or mezerot are not applicable today either, because they depend on the temple. Today, they are inoperative according to the Torah, but are only applicable by rabbinic authority or derabanan. However, some normative areas still apply today. Taharat hamishpacha, the laws of niddah, immersion of women, are laws that continue to apply in the family room, and this is because they do not depend on the temple. They never depended on the temple either. They follow rules by mikra, which is like a rehearsal, so as not to lose the habit of keeping these commandments or mitzvot, that is, to maintain the habit of not losing the custom. That is the rabbinic concept of mikra. So today, the Kohanim continue to avoid contact with corpses or going to a cemetery. Even today, all the laws of kashrut, with their distinctions regarding dietary purity, remain in force because these laws never depended on the temple. Many even believe that these laws of kashrut, or the biblical diet, date back to the time of Noah, when humans were permitted to eat the meat of clean animals after the flood. That is why the laws of Noah, or of the B'nai Enoch, which are universal laws, include a law against eating a live animal, its blood, or carrion. In fact, there is a source in early Christianity, in the book of Acts, where it is decreed that Gentiles are forbidden to eat blood. This is found in Acts chapter 15, verse 29. The reference codification of kosher food today is, as could not be otherwise, the Shulchan Aruch in its tractate Yerdiyah. Remember that today's modern Judaism is a rebirth and comes from the 16th century with the Shulchan Aruch and normative Judaism. Therefore, today's Judaism is more similar to that of the 16th century in the Middle Ages than to the Judaism of the Mishna and the Second Temple period. Always keep this in mind, and it is the key to understanding the apparent contradiction in this Mishnah between the Mishnah itself, which is written by Rabbi Meir, and what Rabbi Yehudah Hanassi says. The laws of purity and impurity are a path, a code, according to Kabbalah that teaches us to see what is unseen. For example, with a biblical sacral reading, purity marks the boundaries of access to the sanctuary and the holy, but this is in the exclusive context of the temple in Jerusalem. But proximity to life and death organizes the map. The most severe impurity is the human corpse, where there is no soul or neshama, flows and losses of vital potential, semen, menstrual blood, childbirth, also discharge, the capacity for contact with the holy for a time. This architecture makes visible the invisible, spiritual life as the axis of the God of Israel. There is also a halakhic disciplinary reading, as Rambam Maimonides teaches the rules limit familiarity with the sacred, generating reverence, not entering the temple like any other place. The purity regime acts as a spiritual pedagogy of the threshold. But there is also a symbolic anthropological interpretation. Purity operates as the maintenance of boundaries and orders of meaning. It is not hygiene, but a ritual language about order and chaos, life and death, inside and outside. This lens helps us see symbolic systems that the physical eye cannot detect because we understand that in the four creative worlds or universes in Bereshit, Genesis, from the world of Bria, where man was placed, the diversity and bipolarity of the whole is manifested in creation. The laws of purity and impurity function as a perceptual training to see what is unseen. They make the intangible visible. That life, birth/death/procreation, radiates a spiritual force that conditions our aptitude for the sacred. And they teach us to inhabit limits. The world is not homogeneous. There are zones of holiness that require preparation, a lens to read the spiritual behind the material. These ideas appear in classical and contemporary frameworks throughout Judaism, but there is also a symbolic anthropological interpretation. Purity operates as the maintenance of boundaries and orders of meaning. It is not hygiene, but a ritual language about order and chaos, life and death, inside and outside. This lens helps us see symbolic systems that the physical eye cannot detect because we understand that in the four creative worlds or universes in Bereshit, Genesis, from the world of Bria, where man was placed, the diversity and bipolarity of the whole is manifested in creation. The laws of purity and impurity function as a perceptual training to see what is unseen. They make the intangible visible. That life, birth/death/procreation, radiates a spiritual force that conditions our aptitude for the sacred. And they teach us to inhabit limits. The world is not homogeneous. There are zones of holiness that require preparation, a lens to read the spiritual behind the material. These ideas appear in classical and contemporary frameworks throughout Judaism. Moment can approach. Ritual purity and the observance of mitzvot return, that energy to the realm of kedusha, of light or of good. This is an ontological metaphor. It does not imply that there are literally entities that suck impurities, but rather that any disconnection from the source allows the other part to strengthen itself. In Kabbalah and in Hasidic texts, such as the Baal Shem Tov and the Tanya, every human act channels Shifa, spiritual flow. If the act is aligned with Kedusha, that energy remains in the holy realm. But if the act is aligned with transgression or unresolved impurity, that flow descends and sustains the kelipot. Teshuvah, return, tevilah, and tevilah in the mikveh redirect that energy. Thus, feeding the forces of evil is not so much a physical process as a didactic image to express that human conscience and behavior determine where spiritual vitality is channeled. On the halakhic level, impurity is a neutral ritual category, and this is the simple or basic vision of the Mishna and the Talmud. But on the mystical level, it symbolizes a space of disconnection where the forces of concealment can be strengthened. Practicing purity and spiritual preparation not only organizes ritual life, but, according to this mystical vision, it withdraws nourishment from darkness and enhances light, teaching human beings to perceive the invisible and direct their vital energy toward the sacred. This concludes today's class. Until the next video.